Thanks very much, Craig. Hi, everyone. So this is Let That Think In, Thought Experiments and Their Application to Cybersecurity. So my name is Matt Wixey. I'm a threat researcher and writer at Sophos. I've been in InfoSec for about 12 years, so I work with John, who did the keynote just now. Although this particular talk is in a personal capacity, so the views and opinions aren't necessarily those of my employer. Before doing threat research, I worked in pen testing, research and development, and threat intelligence at PwC, and before that worked in law enforcement. I'm also a PhD student at UCL. And usually, if you've seen me talk before, I usually talk about very niche, weird and wonderful things like light and sound, attribution, worms, criminal marketplaces, that kind of thing. This is quite a different talk. And also, as you can tell from the opening slide, my ability to keep up with memes ended in about 2017, so there's going to be some really crappy memes in this presentation. So what I'm going to try and do in this talk is explain what a thought experiment is and how it works, try and apply it to cybersecurity, and then give you a guide to creating and using thought experiments as well. So let's start with a brief primer on thought experiments. So it's actually quite hard to define, and there's no consensus in the literature as to what a thought experiment is. It's probably easier to say what they're not. So here are some examples of things that people, mostly thought leaders, have said are thought experiments, mostly on LinkedIn. So a hypothetical scenario based in reality. What if we had £1 billion to spend on security? A tabletop role-playing exercise, so you know the kind of thing, you're the head of a SOC and you've been hit by ransomware, or think like an attacker, that kind of thing. Or analogy, so the one you hear a lot is leaving RDP exposed to the internet is like having your front door open, that kind of thing. That's not to imply that these can't be helpful, but they're not thought experiments in the way that they're commonly understood in other disciplines. I even read, when I was kind of compiling this list, I read about one thought leader in cyber who talked about doing hands-on thought experiments, whatever they are. So why are these things not thought experiments? Well, as I mentioned, there's no consensus on definition, but there are some common elements to the proposed definitions. So it's an imaginary scenario which for some reason is unrealizable in reality. Either ethically, it would be unethical or illegal to actually do it, or it's just completely impractical to do it. And crucially, they have a goal, whether that's to destroy an existing paradigm or support an emerging one. It's not just exploring possibilities and sort of wondering what if and what might happen. And it's not something that's done mentally just because it's more convenient to do it mentally. There's also an element of rigor in the construction of a thought experiment and in the answering of it. So thought experiments typically come in two parts. You have the experiment itself, the scenario, and then you have the argument that follows it. But it's worth also mentioning this is a controversial topic in science and philosophy. So some people disagree that thought experiments can actually be useful. Some say that empirical experiments are more valuable and provide more use. So a really brief overview of thought experiments. They began probably with Socrates and Plato. So the allegory of the cave is probably the most famous one, although there were lots of others. Anyone familiar with the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave? So it kind of, a number of later thought experiments built on that one. So you had things like Descartes' demon, brain in a vat, if you've heard of that, and then ultimately things like the Matrix and stuff as well. They weren't really formalized until 1897 by a German scientist called Ernst Mach, who at the time said they were a necessary prerequisite to doing empirical experiments, although that's no longer considered true. They've obviously been used extensively in philosophy and also in physics. So in physics, there are some really famous examples. There's Galileo, Newton, Schrödinger, Einstein, and you might be familiar with some of those. More recently in information systems research and in politics and in law as well. And then even more recently, AI and privacy. So probably starting in 1940 with the Turing test with regards to AI, and then a lot of others since then as well. So I mentioned empirical experiments, and people sometimes think that these two things, empirical experiments and thought experiments, are in opposition to each other. They're not really, or they shouldn't be. Both of them are manipulating independent variables, applying some sort of control, and then measuring the outcome on a dependent variable in order to test some sort of hypothesis or to test assumptions or to make inferences about the world, or all of them. There are people that say that thought experiments are more of a rhetorical tool, so they're an argument or a paradox or whatever. But ultimately, it's really just the data, and then the interpretation or the discussion of that data is then used to support or refute a position. There is a little bit of a difference between philosophy and physics in that regard. So with philosophical thought experiments, the philosophers do tend to have an argument in mind because philosophers love to argue, whereas with physicists, it's more of a model, like a mental model that they're using to explore something. So let's talk about a few examples of thought experiments. These are all in philosophy. The first one's Mary's Room. Anyone familiar with this one before? Anyone heard of this one? So I'll just kind of read out the thought experiment and then I'll talk about the argument that underpins it. So Mary is a scientist and she has lived her entire life in a black and white room. So everything in the room is black and white. The furniture, her clothes, all the equipment in it, whatever. There are no windows. There's a door, but she can't see through it. The only contact she has with the outside world is with a monitor attached to a camera, but it's a black and white monitor. So Mary has never seen color. But I mentioned she's a scientist and she specializes in neurophysiology. So she knows everything there is to know about color. She knows what happens in the brain when we see a red tomato or a blue sky. She knows the specific wavelength combinations that stimulate the retina for specific colors and how this leads to us associating that stimulation with a word like red or blue. So one day, Mary is released from the room and sees color for the first time. Does she learn anything? That's the thought experiment. So quick show of hands, who thinks that Mary does learn something when she goes out the room for the first time? Yeah, it's quite an intuitive thing, isn't it? So this thought experiment is an argument against physicalism, which is the argument that everything in the universe, including consciousness, is physical. It has some sort of physical form. And it basically argues that there are non-physical things that can only be obtained through experience. So when Mary's released from the room, she experiences color for the first time, as opposed to just knowing everything about it. So it's a really long debate. I'm not going to sort of go into physicalism and sort of the ins and outs of this one. But this is a very famous thought experiment that stimulated a lot of debate. So we can see something interesting about the structure of thought experiments from Mary's Room. This isn't applicable to all, but it is to many. So we have kind of 4 steps. We have an element of world building. So Mary is a scientist in a black and white room. We have some rules. So Mary can't just walk out of the room. There are no windows and so on. We then have a challenge or a conflict. So one day Mary is released. And then finally we have a question, does Mary learn anything? Let's talk about another one, Descartes' demon, which I mentioned earlier. Anyone familiar with this one? No, okay. So it's quite simple. Just imagine that there's an all-powerful demon which presents a complete illusion of the physical world, so that the sky, air, earth, colors, shapes, sounds, all external things are merely delusions which this demon has created. So you don't actually have hands, eyes, flesh, blood, or senses, but you believe you do because of the demon. So this was Descartes' way of exploring what he called systematic doubt. How do I know that anything in front of me is actually real? This was later expanded on with the brain in a vat thought experiment in 1968. How do we know that we're not just brains floating in a vat somewhere and that everything we see is a hallucination? So again, similar structure to Mary's Room. This one doesn't have a particular challenge or conflict, but other than that, it's the same. And then the Experience Machine by Nozick in 1974. So this one is based on a premise that there's a machine which can give you any pleasurable experience you want. So if you're plugged into it, it's indistinguishable from reality, but you'll stay there until you die. And you can choose the pleasurable experience you have. You'll be attached to an intravenous drip, which provides you with nutrition. Do you have any reason not to plug into that machine? So this was Nozick's argument against hedonism. He was basically saying that pleasure is not the only valuable thing in life, that most people wouldn't choose to be plugged into this machine. We want to do certain things, not just have the experience of doing them. We want to be a certain sort of person. If we did plug into this machine, we never see our real friends and family ever again, and so on. So Brown in 1991 suggested 3 types of thought experiment: destructive thought experiments, which destroy or challenge an existing theory; constructive thought experiments, which support a theory, and there are 3 subtypes of those: mediative, where you facilitate a conclusion from a theory; conjectural, where you just have an explanation but not necessarily a theory; and then direct, where you don't start with a theory but you end up with one; and then Platonic thought experiments as well, which are both destructive and constructive. Some other formats that are very common is something called a reductio ad absurdum argument. This is basically where you establish a claim by showing that the opposite position leads to absurdity. So you'll be familiar with this if you had an upbringing like I had. If you do something bad and you tell your mum, I did it because my mate did it, and your mum says, well, if your friend jumped off a cliff, would you do that as well? That's a reductio ad absurdum argument. Along the same lines, like if you ever got told off for picking flowers or something, and then someone said to you, if everyone picked flowers, there'd be no flowers left. That's a reductio ad absurdum argument. Sometimes they come in the form of paradoxes as well. So there are lots of examples of these, but like Achilles and a tortoise is a really famous one by Zeno. Zeno's arrow as well. and sometimes really strange forms as well. So fiction has been argued as being a thought experiment, or at least some examples of fiction. So is The Matrix a thought experiment? Is a good example of that. And then particularly in cybersecurity, there's a whole load of fiction that could be really interesting inspiration for thought experiments. Things like cyberpunk, sci-fi, tech horror, so things like Brave New World, 1984, Black Mirror, that kind of thing. And then koans are a really fascinating one. Anyone familiar with koans? Ever heard of the term before? So they originate in Zen Buddhism. And they're like sort of riddles or puzzles that are given to Zen novices by Zen masters. And sometimes the novices had to think about these for years in silent meditation. Carl Jung said that they aim for the complete destruction of the rational intellect. So they run completely counter to Western dualism and rationalism and that kind of thing. They're intended to like provoke what in Buddhism is called the Great Doubt, so and then eventually lead to enlightenment. But basically they disintegrate logic, or they're intended to. So there's lots of examples. One you've probably heard before is what is the sound of one hand clapping? That's a koan. Another one is, does a dog have Buddha nature? So a student asks this to a master. A lot of koans have an answer which involves a concept of mu, M-U, which is really hard to define, but it basically means like nothingness or unasking the question or just rejecting the premise of the question entirely. I won't go on about koans for too long, but they're really interesting. So about 2,000 of them survived from when they were first built. There have been no new ones written for centuries, but they're online if you want to have a look. I wouldn't binge them because your mind will melt, but definitely have a look at a few. And one really interesting application of thought experiments is to address something called a Kuhnian crisis, named after Thomas Kuhn. So Kuhn's theory, or a Kuhnian crisis, is when you have a paradigm or a theory that explains a certain phenomenon. Over time, that theory will result in more and more anomalies, which at first are either ignored or they're attributed to measurement error or that sort of thing. But at some point, you just can't ignore them anymore. And at that point, you have a Kuhnian crisis. And thought experiments have, in various fields, destroyed that existing paradigm, completely kind of torn it down, and then constructed a new one, which both explains the pre-existing phenomena and also the anomalies. So that's kind of one really interesting application of thought experiments. Some criticisms against thought experiments. So some people have argued that the conclusions from them are sometimes due to biases. So if we take the example of the experience machine, which I talked about, Nozick said that most people would say no to being plugged into the experience machine. But a lot of critics have argued that people wouldn't say no because they're rejecting hedonism. They're saying no because of status quo bias. So they just prefer things the way they are. So some critics proposed a reversal test. So if you knew that you were already plugged into the machine, would you choose to disconnect from it, for example? Norton, who's a very vocal critic of thought experiments, has said that they are just picturesque arguments, that they don't provide us with any new data, that they simply reorganize what we already know and just make it explicit. And then there are epistemological problems associated with thought experiments as well, potentially. So the question that gets asked is, can we genuinely learn new things about reality just by thinking? And if so, where does that knowledge come from? Which in itself is a kind of thought experiment, I think. The counterpoint to it is thought experiments aren't necessarily aimed at generating new knowledge, but just to evaluate and justify theories. Some of the scenarios in thought experiments may be too far removed from reality to actually answer the question or to focus on it. So, for example, there's a thought experiment by a guy called Derek Parfit called Amoebas, which involves humans who split down the middle. And that's all he says about it. So you're trying to kind of conceptualize, well, are they split at the waist or are they split in half? And can they still function as humans? And does it hurt? And that kind of thing. So you just really kind of end up being distracted from the main point at hand. They may also just have really bad logical flaws in them. So Lucretius's javelin is a good example of that. Lucretius's javelin is a reductio ad absurdum argument that the universe is infinite. So he asks us to imagine a man at the edge of the universe throwing a javelin. And he says that the javelin can't go forward because the man's at the edge of the universe, and it can't rebound because what is it rebounding off of? That's absurd. Therefore, the universe is infinite. But he kind of doesn't take into account the fact that a surface can be finite and have no edge, so a sphere, for example. And then finally, thought experiments can involve idealization. So we say what we think an ideally rational, calm person would say in response to a thought experiment, and therefore may not get realistic answers. Okay, that's the boring stuff out of the way. We'll talk about thought experiments and cybersecurity. So why do we need them in cybersecurity? Well, they allow us to test assumptions for impractical scenarios. As I mentioned, they can address Kuhnian crises, which I think we have a number of in cybersecurity. So an example would be humans are the weakest link, right? Which personally I think is quite an outdated way of thinking. And you could argue that there are anomalies associated with that belief. And we also need more thinking in cybersecurity. We often prioritize the accumulation of knowledge, not unreasonably, but kind of thinking about issues in cybersecurity can also be really helpful. And finally, they can be an alternative to or supplement throwaway hot takes, which you've probably seen a lot of on social media. That's not to say that hot takes are bad. They often contain really interesting, fresh insights, but too often they're just posted without much thought, really quickly and just as quickly forgotten, whereas thought experiments could put some rigor and some consideration around them as well. So I'll talk about some thought experiments in related fields, starting with AI. The first one is the kitten and the cockroach. I've tried to look for, I read this once on the internet and I've never been able to find it again. So if you know who did this, let me know and I will credit them. But it's basically this. So imagine that I have a box on either side of me, one on my left, one on my right, cardboard boxes. And the one on the left, I open it up and there's a kitten inside. So it's about 3 months old, really fluffy, really friendly. Who would like to hold the kitten? Quick show of hands. Okay, cool. And then I'll take the kitten back from you. I put it back in the box. On the box on my right, I open that and I have a glass jar. And inside the jar is a cockroach. And the offer is that I will unscrew the jar and I'll tip the cockroach into your hands so you can give it a cuddle. Who would like to hold the cockroach? Okay. Now imagine that I have the ability, with the click of my fingers, to transpose the brains of these two creatures. So I can put the cockroach's brain inside the kitten and the kitten's brain inside the cockroach. So I snap my fingers and that's done. I now open the box on my left again and I take out the kitten. So the kitten is no longer thinking cat thoughts, it's thinking cockroach thoughts. It wants to find somewhere dark and warm to hide away. It wants to lay eggs. It wants to feed. It thinks it's got 6 legs instead of 4. And if you held it, it would probably try and wriggle up your sleeve. Who wants to hold the kitten now? Some strange people over there. So that's the thought experiment. And the idea behind this thought experiment, which does anyone hazard a guess of what that thought experiment is about? You want to shout out? Kind of, yeah. So it's basically about why we shouldn't trust AI. It is saying that no matter how friendly and anthropomorphic and cute and cuddly some form of AI might appear, so whether it's a chatbot, whether it's like Sophie the robot, or it's dressed up to look like, Megan in the film, the recent film, something like that, the brain that's inside that thing is alien to us. It's as dissimilar to our brains as a kitten's brain is to a cockroach. So next we've got Roko's basilisk. I'm imagining people have heard about this. Quick show of hands if you've heard of Roko's basilisk. Okay, I was expecting a few more than that. So Roko's basilisk was in 2010. It got a lot of attention when it first came out because Roko's basilisk is probably the silliest thought experiment ever, but it got loads and loads of hype when it was first released. It's basically about why you should give all your money and time to developing a super intelligent AI to avoid that super intelligent AI torturing and killing you in the future. If you look it up, if you haven't heard of it, you won't understand it because you're not supposed to understand it because it is based on some really, really torturous logic, which only people in a very, very strange corner of the internet actually believe. But the reason it got so much attention is that those people who do buy into that logic were so traumatized by Roko's basilisk that it caused them real, genuine psychological distress. So it's worth looking up just for that reason. There's the Turing test, which you'll be familiar with. So, by Alan Turing in 1940. So originally it involved 3 humans. So you would have a human questioner, and then you would have a man and a woman answering the questions in like closed rooms. And the questioner had to decide who was the man and who was the woman. And then it was changed to include a human questioner, and then you have a human answering the questions and a computer answering the questions. And the questioner has to determine, based on the responses, who's the human and who's the computer. So the Turing test actually has been passed by a number of implementations of AI, including ELIZA. Although John Searle, a philosopher, criticized it in a thought experiment called the Chinese Room, where he basically said that the ability to manipulate symbols doesn't necessarily make a computer intelligent. So if we look at something like ChatGPT, for example, is a good example of that. So ChatGPT, in its simplest form, predicts what the most likely next word in a sentence is. It doesn't mean that it understands what it's saying. It doesn't make it intelligent. So the Chinese room experiment is if you imagine a computer takes Chinese text as input through a slot in a door, processes it according to some instructions, and then produce other Chinese characters as input and put it out through a slot in another door. If it passes the Turing test, it doesn't mean that it understands Chinese. It simulates the ability to understand Chinese. So by the same token, if you had a human in that room who takes in Chinese characters through a slot in the wall, processes them according to the computer's instructions, and then passes them out, it doesn't mean that the human understands Chinese. And then finally, you have the trolley problem, which I imagine most people will be familiar with. So you have a train on the track. If it carries on straight, it kills... Does it kill one person if it goes on straight? And then if you flip a switch, no, it's going to kill 5 people if it carries on straight, or you can flick a switch and it will kill 1 person. Something like that. So it wasn't originally intended for AI, but it's been used for AI ethics with things like self-driving cars and that kind of stuff. Then there's privacy as well. So this is a thought experiment by a guy called James Moore. So this one's pretty simple. If you consider someone who has their whole life under surveillance, and it's really, really intrusive. So all their internet activity, all their phone activity, everything that they do, outside their house, so they're followed, pictures are taken of them, videos, everyone they meet, everyone they talk to, say there are cameras and microphones all over their house, whatever. However, this person that's under surveillance doesn't know anything about it, and it doesn't interfere with their life at all. Their life is absolutely no different to how it was before this intrusive surveillance started. The only thing that's changed is that this person has no privacy. So the question this one poses is the person morally wronged by this? So quick show of hands if you think they are. Yeah? Okay. A bit worried about the people who said no. But the argument here by James Moore is that privacy has an intrinsic justification. Even though no harm comes to you, it is still intrinsically justified. Assassination politics. This is quite a dark one. Anyone familiar with assassination politics? Quick show of hands. No one. Oh, okay. So this is a really interesting one. So assassination politics is a thought experiment created by a guy called Jim Bell in 1997. Jim Bell was a member of the cypherpunks, a group of philosophers, cryptographers, researchers who banded in the kind of early 90s, and they had something really famous called the Cypherpunks mailing list, where they talked about some of their ideas. It was the foundation of a lot of stuff that we use today. Julian Assange was a cypherpunk. PGP came from a cypherpunk from Phil Zimmerman. A lot of the principles underpinning Bitcoin and cryptocurrency came from the cypherpunks as well. So Jim Bell was a member of this group, and assassination politics is basically an incentivized dead pool. So imagine that there's a secure, anonymous way to place a bet online on the date and time of a politician's death. When that pool is large enough, there's sufficient incentive for someone to place their own bet and then assassinate the politician to make sure that their bet wins, and then they collect the pool. So at the time Bell proposed this, it got a lot of attention from federal authorities, as you might imagine. But the tools to actually do it weren't available at the time. So the cypherpunks really wanted like anonymous digital cash, but the things they were using all had kind of flaws, didn't quite work, that kind of thing. But by the time we get to 2013, we have Tor hidden services, we have Bitcoin and other derivatives. And someone actually made this a reality. There was a hidden service on Tor, which had one of these incentivized dead pools. And there were pools worth $75,000 on Barack Obama, Ben Bernanke, and Keith Alexander. Now, obviously, none of those gentlemen were actually assassinated. And really amusingly, in 2018, someone stole all of those Bitcoins. So it's probably a scam. But in 2018, someone created a new one based on a protocol called Augur, which is a decentralized prediction protocol. And that was used to set up new assassination markets, not just on the deaths of politicians, but also on mass shootings and terrorist attacks, really disturbingly. So this is an example of a thought experiment which actually came true. Although, touch wood, no one's been assassinated yet. And then there's the ship of Theseus Mark II. Anyone familiar with the ship of Theseus? Oh, cool. Okay, more people here. People familiar with Trigger's new broom as well? Yeah? Okay, cool. So if you're not, it's from Only Fools and Horses. So Trigger won an award for having the same broom for like 20 years or something, and it had 14 new heads and 17 new handles. So this is essentially the same thought experiment as the ship of Theseus. So if you have a wooden ship and you take away old planks as they decay and replace them to the point where you've replaced all the planks, is it still the same ship or not? So this was later adapted into a thought experiment called Neurath's boat, where sailors have to reconstruct their ship while they're at sea, but they can never start afresh because they're actually sailing it. So instead they have to replace it bit by bit with the rest of the ship in support, so that eventually it's a new boat, but only gradually. And then in 2005, a philosopher called Stanovich adapted Neurath's boat and actually applied it to the process of dealing with things like disinformation and conspiracy theories and irrational beliefs and that kind of thing. His kind of concept was that you can revise your beliefs recursively. So if you identify certain tenets of belief that are not rotten, that you can actually stand on and use to support you, then you can stand on those and then replace the planks that are rotten, i.e. your kind of belief in conspiracy theories or whatever. So that's the experiments in related fields. I'll move on to some thought experiments that I've created. These are drafts, and they are not very good. And I will be more than happy if you want to adapt them, borrow them, steal them, change them, whatever you like. But I've got 3 of them, and we'll run through all of them and see what you think. Okay, so the first one's called Cookie Monsters. So imagine that every time you interact with a computer, you leave a trace behind, a unique encrypted identifier which contains an encrypted form of your name. And it's literally in everything you do. So every packet that gets sent from your machines, every command you type, every message you send on social media or email or whatever, it contains this tag. It's not visible unless you know it's there and you're looking for it. And it can be decrypted and someone can get back your name. You don't know this tag exists until one day you do. What's changed? So you could actually use this thought experiment for several arguments. You could use one from an attribution perspective. So if you think about it, this tag sort of already exists in behavioral signatures. So when we're trying to attribute threat activity, for example, we're trying to find out kind of who a threat actor is or where they're based, we tend to only focus on discrete identifiers like IP addresses, emails, domain names, that kind of thing. We might look at like correlating office hours with time zones with attack activity and that sort of thing. But we don't tend to look at behavioral signatures, which all human beings leave behind when they interact with something else. So when you write, for example, you have a unique writing style, you have a particular typing speed, you will use commands with certain switches and you'll tend to use those switches in the same order and that kind of thing. You could also look at this from a privacy perspective. So by knowing that those unique behavioral traits exist, which are of a great deal of interest to a number of people who might be monitoring activity, you could try to change them. And then finally, you could look at it from a kind of, I guess, a wider ethical perspective. So do we act differently when we know that we're being observed and monitored and tracked? If we did know exactly how much of our data is tracked and analyzed, would it change our online behaviors? If this thing was real, what would it say about, or, what would happen with trolling, for example? If we knew that all our online activity was traceable and anonymity was impossible, would that be good or bad? So that's that thought experiment. this is an interesting one. So this is called Keyboard Warriors, or if you like, Snow Crash 2. So imagine there's a new kind of malware, and this new kind of malware can directly harm people. Once it's on an infected system, it causes their monitors to flash at a certain frequency, which induces a seizure. So nobody has died from this yet, but several people have been injured. And in the future, many people may die, and everyone's vulnerable to it. So the question is this a kinetic weapon? Is it a weapon? And how should we respond to it? So this one's a bit of a Trojan horse thought experiment. This is based on some of my PhD research. And actually, attacks like this have already happened. In 2008, some attackers uploaded flashing GIFs to an epilepsy sufferers support forum, causing several people to have seizures. There was also an individual in, I think it was 2019, who suffered from epilepsy, and people tagged him in tweets containing flashing GIFs in an attempt to get him to have seizures. There have also been, as you're probably aware, vulnerabilities that have been demonstrated in things like pacemakers, insulin pumps, cars, medical implants, OT, IoT, to the point of causing explosions or the release of mercury and that sort of stuff. So this particular thought experiment is an argument for more or would lead to an argument around more stringent legislation and a redefinition of the term cyber weapon. The kind of old paradigm here is that cyber weapons are abstract, that it's a hyped up threat, not helped by journalists in kind of the 2000s talking about things like digital Pearl Harbors and cyber 9/11 and that sort of stuff. But the old paradigm is that cyber weapons can't cause as much damage as kinetic weapons, that they could even be used to wage more moral warfare or more bloodless warfare, and that they're only really applicable to things like espionage and sabotage. But the fact that there are now attacks which can cause kinetic harm would suggest that there's maybe a Kuhnian crisis, that there are anomalies here. And then finally, proxy wars. So imagine that both threat actors and defenders, so both red and blue, increasingly leverage increasingly powerful AI until eventually all attacks and all defenses are completely designed, planned, and created by machine learning models, and there's no human involvement or interaction. Has anything really changed other than the fact that we could just chill out and just watch? Or should we watch? So I'll leave that one with you. So benefits for applying thought experiments to cybersecurity. So they don't cost anything other than time, which is a good thing. Even a bad thought experiment, like the three examples I've just shown you there, could generate some discussion. But at their best, and as in other disciplines, they've replaced entire paradigms and completely changed ways of thinking. They can just be used to reframe arguments and make them more persuasive, encourage more scientific thinking, and they're also just fun. It's more imaginative or refreshing than just a plain argument. At least I think so anyway. Some drawbacks for them in cybersecurity: it can be quite hard to come up with them for a field as specific as cybersecurity. Security topics tend to be more niche and less universal than, say, philosophy or physics. And let's be honest, like normally the problems we're dealing with in cybersecurity tend to be lower stakes, not always, but most of the time, compared to, what is personal identity and is consciousness real and that sort of thing. There may be flaws in construction, kind of logical flaws, particularly if we start using them and we're sort of new to doing it in this discipline, we might make mistakes. And as you can tell from those three examples, you often need to make heavy use of analogy and metaphor, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's possibly a bad thing. So, So let's talk about designing a thought experiment. So I'll run through a really quick guide on kind of how to do it. So to start with, you don't necessarily have to come up with a thought experiment from scratch. You can just repurpose an existing one. So here are three that I've just repurposed. These are very much off the top of my head, but we could do Schrodinger's breach. So what if we acted as though we're simultaneously in a state of being compromised and not being compromised? The veil of ignorance. So originally this was about kind of how we deal with issues around sort of equality and social class and kind of prejudice and that sort of thing. But imagine that we have to design the entire cybersecurity industry from scratch. But we don't know who we're going to be in that industry. So you don't know if you're going to be red or blue. You don't know what role, grade, level of education or knowledge you're going to have. And then whatever industry you design, you have to work in it. What choices would you make? And then finally, the security machine. So this is sort of a take on the experience machine. So imagine that AI takes over all security research, produces really superior results to humans. Would we still continue doing it anyway? Would we still do vulnerability research? Would we still look for vulnerabilities? Would we still try and find new ways to bypass EDR and AV, that kind of thing? Would there be any point in it? And it's more about kind of thinking about why we do these things. So do we do it for a larger ethical purpose? Do we do it because it pays well, because we enjoy the intellectual challenge of doing it, and so on? So 5 steps to coming up with your own thought experiments. Firstly, what is the argument? So are you trying to destroy an existing theory or create a new one, or both? And how can you actually test that premise and explore it? Step 2, world building. So you want some rigor in creating a model. If you have kind of people or systems in that thought experiment, make sure that they behave in a particular and consistent way. You don't have to limit yourself to reality. In fact, you shouldn't. You shouldn't have to make it realistic or practical. But consistency is the key thing. And then you want to come up with your rules. So you want to patch up plot holes, define the behaviors, seal off the logical flaws and escape clauses that are in your thought experiments. And remember that while the scenario itself might be implausible, the rules should be conceivable. And then the optional step of introducing a challenge or a conflict. So what changes about the scenario that you've presented to kind of kick off this thought? You can kind of think of this as like the inciting incident in a screenplay or something, which should build on the scenario rules. It's not always necessary. You don't necessarily have to have it. And then finally, the question. So what question does the thought experiment provoke? So this is things like what has changed? Why or why not? Is this possible? And so on. So that's kind of the 5 steps to producing a thought experiment. And then you have a last step, which is the actual output itself, which will be an argument which is based on that thought experiment, tries to answer the question, explores its own implications, and then evaluates the argument for errors as well. Okay, we made it to the end. So this was an introduction to the world of thought experiments, very much an overview. There's obviously been tons written about them. So I've tried to jam as much as I can into about 40 minutes. So thought experiments are low cost, but potentially very powerful. They've had really dramatic impacts in philosophy, in physics, and in a lot of other fields as well. So potentially it's something that we could make use of in cybersecurity a bit more. There is more research needed on it. So if you're looking for a research topic, this could be a good one. And it's potentially a really interesting mashup of philosophy and cybersecurity and philosophy of science and that kind of thing as well. So I'm ending with a call to action, which is think about some assumptions or theories in your daily work, in your particular corner of cybersecurity, and how you might be able to apply thought experiments to it, or even wider at an industry level with things you've seen. Remember that the whole point is either to support dominant or existing theories or to challenge them. So you could do both, or either one. And then I've also got a little bit of a challenge. So if you'd like to come up with your own security-related thought experiment, so 30 days from now, you've got to send them to me at that email address. The one I like best, in my really unqualified opinion, gets a very, very small prize. And I'll give you bonus points if it's a koan as well, because it's been kind of a few hundred years since anybody's actually come up with a new koan. So if you're able to come up with one and it's based in cybersecurity, you won't get a very small prize. You'll get a small prize. So next step up. So if you're interested, lots of references here. So these contain kind of all the thought experiments that I've talked about during this presentation, lots of discussions around thought experiments generally, and that kind of thing. And that's me. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that was interesting and or useful. I think we have quite a bit of time left, so if anybody's got any questions, let me know. But thank you. Yeah, question at the back. Yeah, absolutely. You'd have kind of a number of choices, I think, if you were doing that. I think it's a really good idea, definitely. So one thing you could do is you could make the thought experiment an argument, but you could kind of almost come up with 2 opposing thought experiments and sort of split the room into 2, send them away for a few minutes, have them, come up with an argument based on a thought experiment, and then come back and present to the other half, and then kind of talk about the pros and cons of each one. But yeah, absolutely. Kind of, I think, even if you were just doing one thought experiment, sort of putting it out there, getting people to kind of think about the proposition that's behind that thought experiment, and then either sort of thinking about that internally or sharing it with the group could be really useful. Yeah. Yes.
So you to make a thought experiment. How do you determine if it's any good? Because everyone's got different perspectives, different educational level. Someone might, you do one about cybersecurity, for example, and they might not have a knowledge of cybersecurity, but they're related to something else like physical security or protection or something in their lives. So, like, who's the ultimate judge if the thought experiment's any good? Because you might say it's good, I might say it's bad. Who's right, who's wrong? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, so even with full-time professional philosophers who come up with thought experiments, so Mary's Room, for example, was done by a guy called Frank Jackson, who's kind of quite a well-known professor, philosopher of science. People have said that thought experiment contains flaws, and it doesn't take into account this and that and that. So I guess there's not really kind of an ultimate way to tell. It's certainly in philosophy, criticism of the thought experiments are based on sort of logical flaws in them, where you kind of maybe make an assumption for which there's no basis, for example. I don't think sort of kind of repurposing thought experiments for like particular disciplines is necessarily bad. I mean, you kind of want to make sure that you caveat it maybe. If you wanted to say this is only applicable to physical security or this is only applicable to cybersecurity, you could kind of caveat it with that. But yeah, I guess like I said, kind of the main thing you would want to do to try and make it as robust as possible is to try and seal off like logical flaws, plot holes, that kind of thing, and to make sure you're not making sort of deductive leaps in either the thought experiment itself or in the argument that it uses. Yeah.
It'd still be good though,
It depends what the goal of it is. So if the goal of it is just to get people to think about something that they hadn't previously thought of, then yes. If your goal is to use it to support an argument which says X is the case and Y is not the case, then if you have a logical flaw in it, that's almost sort of a backdoor that could be, yeah, exactly. So yeah, it depends what the goal is really. Any more for any more? Nope. Okay. Thank you very much.